I really have the honor to introduce Noah Albelda, that she accepted the invitation to come and to really talk about a subject that I think it's very important for us to know, and it is her interest and her expertise and many research that she did about that, and she will tell what she sees and what she's going to talk. Noah, thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm going to try to speak without a microphone because I have to use this, and then with the microphone in the other hand I feel kind of like I have to juggle a lot of things at once. Oh, great, it's on. So yeah, my name is Noah. I'll tell you a little bit about myself and then we'll get going. I completed my PhD about a year ago at the Tel Aviv University in neuroscience. And I actually, in my PhD, I didn't do any research about movement. My research was more about brain development. And we were looking at how factors that we encounter in our very early days, right after we're born, how they affect our brain development. And specifically, we looked at things that can happen to us at a very young age that increase the risk that we develop schizophrenia and depression as adults. But during my PhD, I did a lot of reading about development. Also during my PhD, as happens a lot of the time, I got really, really fat because I just like sat all day in front of the computer and read articles and did experiments. And towards the end of my PhD, I remember the exact moment I was at home, I looked at myself in the mirror and suddenly I said, oh my God, who is this person? I never used to look like this. I used to be very active as a kid. I used to ride horses all the time and stuff like that. And then I said, okay, something has to change. And I started a new hobby, which is long distance running, which I do until today. And why am I telling you this? Because I think that was a moment that literally sort of changed my life. Also, I got thin again. Well, not thin, but thinner. And also, I found out, I mean, are there people here that have a PhD, MD? Okay, so I'll tell you, a PhD and an MD is a very long journey, and a very difficult journey, and a very stressful journey. And the last 2 years of my PhD were a lot of stress, and then some more stress, and more stress, and more stress. And when I started running, I noticed that every time after I finish a run, I come back home, no stress, feeling great, life is beautiful, I love what I do, I enjoy the research, and that feeling made me be interested in the links between movement and cognition, movement and psychological well-being. So I did a lot of reading about that, and today I also give a lot of talks about it. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is how the brain plans movement. Now, we're not going to talk only about the motor system, because I'm going to show you that in order for the brain to plan movement in a good way, it needs to combine a lot of information from the outside world. So we're going to talk a little bit also about our sensory systems, and we're going to see how the sensory system and how the motor system sort of integrate together and allow us to create complex movements. Okay, so before we go to the brain, let me introduce you to this little guy. Do you know who he is? That's E. coli, which is a bacteria that lives all around us and also inside of us. Now, I want to ask you, can this little guy, this E. coli, does he have movement abilities? Of course. Now, what makes him move? Does he have a brain? No, he's a single-celled organism. He doesn't have a brain, he doesn't have a nervous system, and yet he can move. Now, what makes him move? Yeah, he has a tail. This tail is called the flagellum. And when he moves his tail around, he can swim. He lives in liquids, so he can move around. Now, what makes him move? He has two motivations to move. which are quite similar to our motivation, our basic motivation. So food, so let's say positive stimuli that makes you want to get closer to them, basically food, okay, like sugar. And what other motivation to move?
Away from something.
Away from something that is dangerous. So if he finds himself like in a environment which is too acidic and he needs to get away, okay? So these two motivations help him move towards food and away from danger. And to do this, he doesn't need a brain. He has very simple cell mechanisms that allow him to move. So movement is not dependent upon the brain, okay? Now, we have a brain, and we need this brain to move, so I want to ask you now, what does the brain give us that E. coli doesn't have? Why do we need our brain to move? Why can't we have just like this nice tail behind us and float around? Direction. Okay, but E. coli can direct himself right, left, forward, backwards. It doesn't have a problem.
The environment is more
yeah, so exactly. So we live in an environment which is much more complex than E. coli's environment, and we're not automatons, right? We want to be able to have a more complex control on when we decide to move and how we do it, okay? So we don't want to be these beings which are, you know, we see a stimuli and then we make some sort of movement which is automatic, we don't have to think about it. That's not how people behave in the world. And the fact that we have a brain helps us to integrate, as I said before, a lot of very complex stimuli, and that helps us plan a lot of complex movements. And also, if you think about it, it helps us also be able to inhibit movement, right? Because sometimes movement is not the best choice. Sometimes moving now is worse than, okay, let's just wait a few minutes and let's make this movement like in 5 minutes, okay? So our brain actually helps us create more complex movements, think about these movements, avoid movements which are redundant, and we'll see that, we'll come back to that issue later. Okay, so if we think about our nervous system, especially the central nervous system, the nervous system has 2 or 3 basic roles. The first role is, of course, to know what's happening around us in the world, okay? For those of you that want the presentation, I will send it to Chava, and she will send it to you by email, okay? So the first thing that our brain needs to be able to do is know its environment, right? And how do we get to know the environment? How do we know what's happening around us? We have our senses, right? We hear things, we see things, we smell, we taste, we feel, okay? And this is done by our sensory systems and by our sensory organs, the eyes, the ears, the mouth, the nose, etc. Now, once the brain knows what's happening around it, it needs to decide which of the stimuli that I encounter in a certain moment are important and which are less important, right? Which stimuli do I have to respond to and which stimuli I can ignore, okay? So if I'm in a room and there's an air conditioner on and this air conditioner keeps making this sort of buzzing noise, this is not important in my world. This has no impact on my ability to survive in the world, so the brain just sort of turns this noise down and I can ignore it, okay? But if I'm standing in the middle of the road and I don't know, 2-ton truck is driving towards me at 200 kilometers per hour, this is a very important stimuli, and if I will not notice it and if I will not react to it, then I will soon be dead, right? So the brain needs to know not only what's happening around it, but also to decide what is more important and what is less important. And once the brain decides that something is important, that it requires some sort of action, it needs to plan this action and make it happen. And this happens, of course, through our motor systems, right? If we're talking about an action which is an actual movement in the world. But this is not the end of the story. I will show you towards the end of the lecture that once our motor system makes the proper response, immediately it sends sort of a feedback back to the brain that tells it, you told me to move and I moved and this is how I did it, okay? And then the brain knows that something happened in the world, that the plan that he sent to the motor system was in fact carried out and carried out properly. Okay? And this is sort of an ongoing cycle of sensory stimuli going in, motor movements or motor commands being sent out, and sensory stimuli going back in. Okay? And as I wrote here, everything else that we know how to do is a bonus. Now, why am I saying it's a bonus? Because in order for me to survive in the world, I'm not talking about being happy or anything like that. Just the basic ability to survive, I need to understand the world and I need to react to it. Everything else that we developed during evolution, as I said, is a bonus, and we're happy that we got it, of course, but for my immediate survival, these are the three basic things that my brain and my body have to know how to do. So we're going to try to elaborate now on each one of these stages. So let's start with our senses. How many senses do we have? 5 basic senses, but immediately, soon I will show you that we actually have 7. Okay, so of course we have these 5 basic senses of hearing, listening, hearing, seeing, feeling, smelling, and tasting. And we have sensory organs, which are specialized organs that can pick up stimuli from the environment, right? Like when I'm using my eyes, what do my eyes pick up from the environment? What goes into the eyes? Light, right? And my ears? What makes me listen? Vibrations, right? Sound is actually vibration of molecules in the air, and when I taste something or smell something, these are chemicals that go into my mouth or into my nose, and when I touch something, this is mechanic pressure on my skin. Okay, the touch organ, of course, is the skin, the biggest sensory organ that we have. Now, what happens in these sensory organs is that inside of them we have special cells which are called sensory receptors. Sensory receptors, these are actually neurons, okay, nervous system cells. So these are neurons that sit in the periphery, in the peripheral nervous system. And these neurons are very special because they're adapted to picking up physical stimuli in the world and then converting them to electrical signals. Now, why is this so important? Because the brain only speaks in one language, and that language is the electrical language. Okay? What happens inside the brain is that neurons talk to each other by sending electric pulses from one neuron to another. Okay? Now, when we pick up stimuli in the environment, these are not electrical signals. Like we said, this can be light or vibrations or mechanical touch. And what these special cells can do is take all these different physical stimuli and just turn them into electrical pulses that are being sent all the time into the brain. Okay? This process, in Hebrew it's called atmara sensorit. In English it's called sensory transduction. Okay, so just taking the environment and just turning it into electrical pulses. Now, you can see that these receptor cells are very different from one another because each one of them is specialized to a certain sense, right? So the eyes, the sensory receptors in the eyes are sensitive to light, and the sensory receptor in the ears are sensitive to vibrations of molecules in the air, and so on and so on. Okay? Now, why did I say that we have not 5 senses but 7 senses? Because we have 2 more senses which are very important, but they are not necessarily directed towards the outer environment. They are directed more towards the inside of the body. Now, because we are so, I would say this, we take them for granted. We are not even aware that they exist. That's why when I ask people, and also my students, I teach students at the university, I ask them how many senses do we have? The answer will always be 5. I have to tell them that no, it's not 5, it's 7, because as I said, these are so ingrained in us that we don't even think about them. The only time we start to think about them is when something happens and they're gone, and then we are in a big trouble. Okay, so what are these 2 mysterious additional senses? First of all, our vestibular sense, which helps us do a very important thing, and that is being able to stand upright without falling. So we'll talk a little bit about this sense when we get to talk about the cerebellum in the brain, and I'll show you that this sense is very important not only for our motor abilities and not only for our coordination, but also for our psychological well-being, especially in regards to little kids. Okay, and when I get there, I think if there are people here in the crowd which have ever suffered from vertigo, which I have had a few years ago, you know that it's a very, very frightening and very terrible experience. Okay, so that's the vestibular, our vestibular sense, and the last sense is made of 2 little senses which are called proprioception and interoception. In Hebrew, it's proprioceptia veinteroceptia. Not a big difference. So proprioception and interoception. So proprioception is actually the sensory feedback that the brain gets from our muscles, from our ligaments, and from our joints. Thank you. Okay. And this is, I already talked about this a little bit, that I said that once we carry out a movement, the brain will get feedback from the muscle and from the ligaments and from the joints that the movement has been carried out properly. This helps us build a sense of bodily awareness, and also I will talk a little bit about this at the end. Interoception is the same thing, but this sensory information comes not from the outer body, but from the inner organs. So our stomach, our intestines, our lungs, our heart, okay? And this helps the brain know what is going on inside the body and keep the body in a sort of homeostatic state. Okay? Now, I will not talk about interoception because that is a little bit less relevant to movement, but as I said at the end, I will talk about proprioception and why it's so important, again, not only for my ability to feel my body, but also for my psychological well-being and my feeling of control and autonomy in this world. Okay? Okay. So once my sensory organs detect stimuli in the environment, as I said, they will take the stimuli, convert them into electrical signals, and these electrical signals will start climbing up into the brain. They will have a few stops on the way. These signals will go through the spinal cord, assuming these are stimuli coming from the body. If these are stimuli coming from the face area, they will go straight into the brainstem. After the brainstem, they will get into an area in the brain which is called the thalamus. The thalamus is a very important part of the brain. Its role in the sensory systems is to be sort of merkazia. I forgot the word. Sort of like a switchboard, which tells the sensory information to which part of the cortex it needs to go. So stimulation coming from the ears, the thalamus will send it to the auditory cortex. Stimulation coming from the eyes, the thalamus will send it to the visual cortex, and so on. Okay, so it helps the information get where it needs to get in the cortex. And the final and highest place which the sensory information will arrive is the cortex. And in the cortex we have what we call the primary cortex, which is the sensory cortex that will do the most basic analysis on the information that it gets. I will give examples in a minute. And after that, we have what we call the associative cortex, or the secondary cortex. And there will be a more complex analysis of the information, which will help us not only see or hear or taste or smell, but also understand, what am I looking at? What am I hearing? Okay, is this a cat meowing or is this a dog barking? What am I touching? Am I touching an apple or am I touching a bottle of water? Okay, and the highest cortical areas are also connected to memories. So when I listen to a cat meow, suddenly I remember my 3 cats at home and how I found them and how nice it is to pet them and feel their soft fur, and so on and so on. Okay? Now, in order for us to be aware of stimuli around us, the information needs to get to the cortex, because we know that until it gets to the cortex, we as people can't consciously say, okay, I hear something, I see something, I taste something, I smell something. So for us to be aware of the environment, the information must reach the cortex. Okay? And we know that people that have cortical trauma, a lot of the times they lose the ability to be conscious to stimuli around them. Okay, because that part of the brain that creates awareness is not working properly. Okay, now I want to put a little emphasis on 2 sensory systems which I think are most important to our movement abilities. The first is, of course, the visual system. And why is the visual system so dominant in movement? Because the visual system guides our movements to the stimuli around us. Okay, so if I want to pick something up, how do I know where it is in the world? I see it, yeah? Of course, my eyes tell my brain, okay, if you want to pick up this bottle of water, it's on your left and a little bit below you. Okay, so the visual system is very important, and when we look at the visual system, we can divide it into what we call 2 streams of information analysis. We have what is called the ventral stream, which is all the areas in the brain that start from here. V1 is our primary visual cortex. Yeah, so the thalamus, when it gets information from the eyes, will send it straight to the visual cortex. And from the visual cortex, the information will go either to our temporal lobe, and the areas here in the temporal lobes that belong to the visual systems, they will help me to know what am I looking at. Okay, so as I said before, is this a bottle of water? Is this a watermelon? Is this a person? And so on. Okay, so this is in Hebrew, we call it maslul hama. Okay, because it answers the question, what am I looking at? But to my subject, the more important stream is what we call the dorsal stream. These are areas of the brain, again, they start from back here, the visual cortex, but they go up to the parietal lobe, right to the top of the head. And the areas sitting here will answer another question, which is, where is this stimuli located in the world? Okay, so this part of the brain, it doesn't tell me what I'm looking at, it tells me where it is. And why this is so important to movement is obvious. If I want to manipulate an object, if I want to move towards an object, I need to know where it is in space around me. Okay? So this is in Hebrew, arutz ha'efo, the where is it stream. But I will say more than that, it's not only where is it, it also gives me information about how to manipulate objects, okay? So not only where is it, also what am I supposed to do with it, okay? If this is a cup, how am I supposed to pick it up? If this is a wheel, how am I supposed to operate it so that my car can drive properly? Now we see in people that have trauma to the brain in these areas, in their dorsal stream, they're still able to identify objects, no problem, but they're not able to manipulate them. by using their eyesight. Okay? And vice versa, people that have brain trauma in the areas of the ventral system, they don't have any trouble manipulating objects, but they can't identify them. Okay? So as I said, this dorsal stream is very important for the guidance of movement, and also anatomically in the brain, these areas are very well connected to the areas of the motor systems. Okay? So they are really intimately connected. כן, הם יוכלו, אם את תראי להם בקבוק למשל, אז הם לא יכולו להגיד לך שזה בקבוק, אבל ברגע שאת תגידי להם להרים אותו, ברגע שהם הם ירימו אותו, לא, אבל גם ברגע שהם ייגעו בבקבוק, הם יגידו לך שזה בקבוק דרך חוש המגע, אוקיי? She was asking if I take these people which have trauma to the ventral stream and I show them like a water bottle and ask them what is this, they won't be able to tell me, but if I let them touch it, then the moment they touch it, then they know it's a bottle. And if I ask them, even without touching, ask them what do you do with it, even though they don't consciously identify it, they don't know it's a water bottle, but they will tell me, I think it's something that maybe you use to drink from it and so on, okay? So this is kind of like a dissociation between our ability to identify and our ability to act on objects in the world. Okay, so as I said, the dorsal stream. The other sense, which is very intimately connected to our motor abilities, is the somatosensory sense. That's kind of funny, somatosensory sense. This is what people usually call the touch, חוש המגע, but it's not only touch, it's also pain and temperature, so the correct name is somatosensory. This is all the information that my brain gets from the skin. So as I said, it's touch, it's pain, it's temperature, it's something hot or cold, and so on. Now, why is this so important? As you can see again in the brain, you see here the primary somatosensory cortex. So the information from my skin will go first to this area. And this area is right behind the primary motor cortex, who is responsible for sending output to the muscles and helping us move the muscles. And these two areas, they always talk, okay? So my motor areas are always aware of what is happening on the surface of my skin. Is someone touching me? Do I feel pain? Do I feel pressure? Okay? And of course this has to be so, because for me to be able to make let's say a reasonable movement, a movement that has an objective, I need to react to what's happening around me, right? So if someone is, I don't know, if someone suddenly grabs my hand, there is no point in trying to pull away my left hand if someone is grabbing my right hand, right? So the motor areas always are aware of what's happening, as I said, on the surface of my body. This area also helps the brain know not only if someone is touching me, but also where is my body located in space. Okay, which is also important because the brain can't send the commands to the muscles if it doesn't know where the muscles are. Okay, and this again goes back to the proprioception, which I will talk some more about. Okay. Okay. Sure.
Why do you isolate the sensory-motor sense? I mean, if I hear something and I move my head, it also has to do with the skill.
Yeah.
I test something and I use my face, also has to do something. I mean, all other senses also are very connected to motor.
Of course, they are, but again, if you taste something and you want to make like a face, your brain will have no ability to make that face if it doesn't know where your face is in space. Okay, so in the end, every movement that you plan builds upon somatosensory information. Okay, of course it can be as a reaction to something you tasted. The example you gave about hearing is less relevant because when we hear something and turn the head, it's usually a reflex. So this is less in the control of the higher areas of the brain. It's more brainstem, spinal cord, and so on. Okay, so I will nedect at me. I'm not saying that the other senses are not important, but if we look at the brain and like the anatomical connections, we can see that vision and somatosensory are the most intimately connected to the motor system, and they will be involved in any movement that we plan. Okay? Yeah. Yeah. The amygdala. Okay, so the amygdala, for these people that don't know, is one of the most important emotional centers of the brain. It will generate the emotional response if we see something that scares us or something that makes us angry. Now, it depends, because if we encounter a stimulus which is dangerous to us, the information will first go to the amygdala. And because we have to react very quickly, and it will then go to the other areas in a bit of a delay, and then it will also go back to the amygdala. So we have like these two pathways.
So my immediate response would be undifferentiated with the what and where?
No, the information to the where stream gets there before it gets to the what stream. Okay, it goes to the amygdala first, then it goes to where is it, and only then it goes to what is it. And that's why a lot of the times we react to something and only then we realize, oh, this is not a snake, this is just a gardening hose. Okay? Okay, so now we get to the important stuff, and that's the motor systems in our brain. Now, if we think about movement, we can divide movement into roughly two big classes. The first one are reflexes, which I'm not going to talk about because they are mostly simple movements which we generate automatically. Sometimes also we can't control them, so they will happen even if we don't want them to happen. And these are usually simple and fast movements with the goal of keeping us from harm. So if I touch a plate which is really hot because someone took it out of the oven and didn't tell me, be careful, this is hot, then my hand will move back so that I don't get burned, okay? If someone throws a ball at my face, then I will automatically pick up my hands to protect my face. These movements are all controlled by the spinal cord. Because we want to make them happen really quickly, we don't have time to send the information to the brain, to let the brain plan, and then send orders to the muscles. This takes way, way too long, and by the time all this finishes, then I will have a serious burn because I'm touching this really hot plate. So the spinal cord takes over, does all the planning, does all the management of the movement. Now the brain is not oblivious. The brain will get sort of a report that the reflex has been initiated, but it will usually not be involved. Now, we have a certain ability to inhibit reflexes. So if I now have a steaming pot of something really tasty which I cooked because I have guests coming for lunch, and I pick it up and it's really, really hot, I'm gonna try really hard not to drop it so all my hard work doesn't, go down the drain. So I will try to find something really fast to put the pot on. But again, like if this pot is really, really, really hot, then it will be difficult for me to inhibit the reflex, and eventually I will drop it. Okay? Yes, not to blink is something you can try to do. I think after about a minute and a half, it will drive you crazy. But I want to talk more about movements that we initiate, what we call in Hebrew תנועות רצוניות, voluntary movements. And these are movements which are initiated and first of all planned and then initiated by the brain. And as you can see behind me, you can see that a lot of areas in the brain are involved in planning and carrying out even the simplest of movements. Okay, so this is sort of a scheme, you know, like a box and arrow scheme of all the motor systems involved. These are the areas in the brain, and we're going to talk a little bit about each one of these areas and its involvement in movement. So we're going to start with the cortex, the motor cortex, and I'll show you that we can divide the cortex again roughly into 3 types of areas which are involved in the planning and the initiation of movements. The areas which I have marked in blue, so the prefrontal cortex and the parietal cortex, these are not motor areas per se. These are areas which are responsible for the decision that I have to move. Not how I'm going to move, but you have to move because something now is happening around you which requires some sort of reaction. Okay? So the prefrontal cortex is very important for our ability to plan. Not only movement, by the way, anything that requires planning the prefrontal cortex is involved in it. It's what we call in Hebrew תפקודים קוגניטיביים גבוהים, higher cognitive functions. So this area needs to tell me, okay, something is happening, you have to move, do something. Also, the parietal cortex, the areas sitting inside the parietal cortex, again, they will give me the drive or the feeling that I have to move. And this is related to our feeling that when we do voluntary movements, we do them of our own volition, of our own free will, rather than, you know, the feeling that someone is pulling the strings and we're like a puppet on a string. And we know that people that, again, have damage to these areas, sometimes they make movements, and when you ask them, why did you make the movement? They will not know why. They will not be aware of their of the fact that they, in fact, initiated the movement. They will have this strange feeling like someone is controlling them from the outside. Okay? So as I said, these are not motor areas per se, but they're very important for our ability to control and initiate movement, and again feel that we have autonomy and we control our body and not being manipulated from the outside. The areas which I marked in red, so the supplementary motor area, SMA, and the premotor area, PMA, these are the areas that are planning the movements. Okay, we also call them the association motor cortex. So these are the areas that, that plan the movements. Now I have to say, unfortunately, after many years of research, we still don't know a lot about these areas and exactly what they do and how they operate. We have limited information, but I will tell you what we know. The last area in the cortex, which I marked in orange, the primary motor cortex, this is the area that is responsible for taking what was planned and sending it out to the spinal cord, and from there to the muscles. Okay, so he will be the, I don't know, the המוציא לפועל, כן. The executor, right, thank you. The primary motor cortex. Okay, so this will be the last area in the cortex that will be activated before the information is sent out to the spinal cord and then to the muscles. So you see that a lot of cortical area is devoted to planning and executing movement. And let's try to elaborate a little bit about these different areas. First of all, as I said, the motor association cortex. So we have the premotor cortex here in blue, and the supplementary motor area here in purple. As I said, we don't know a lot about these areas. We do know that they are crucial for planning movements, because when they get damaged, people lose the ability to plan their movement. So their movement becomes fragmented and sometimes exaggerated. So like they might want to pick up like this plastic cup of water, which needs to be picked up quite, gently, and they will come and sort of, throw it up in the air because they can't plan exactly how much force they need to put into the movement, etc. Now, what is the distinction between them? We know that the supplementary motor area is responsible for the ability to plan a series of movements one after the other. Okay, so let's say that you're playing the piano and you're looking at your note sheet and you're thinking ahead and you're saying, okay, so now I need to press, I don't know, my understanding in piano playing is 0, but you know, I have to press this bar and then this bar and then this bar, and we plan ahead, we plan like 5, 6 movements ahead, then we need this area. And the second area, the premotor area, we know that it helps us not only plan the movement, but also keep this plan alive if there is some sort of delay. Okay, so I will give you an example. Let's say that you're sitting in your car and the light is red, and then it becomes orange, and you know that in a millisecond it's going to be green and you're going to have to press the gas. So you're starting to plan the movement ahead. When the light becomes orange, the movement is usually already planned, but you know that you're not supposed to execute it yet. So this area, the neurons, the cells in this area, they become really, really active, and then it's sort of a motor memory. They keep the plan alive until you can physically execute it. Okay? So this is basically what we know about these two areas. Again, it's not a lot, but this is what we have so far. Okay, so that's the association cortex, and as I said, these areas involved in planning the movements, but the cortex never works alone when it needs to plan movements. This is for 2 reasons. First of all, the ability of the cortex to plan movements is quite rough. Rough, I mean that it plans the movements, but it doesn't really give you the fine tuning of, you know, coordination and how your eyes exactly need to guide your hand, and okay, you need to operate these muscles, but in what order, okay, and in how fast you need to make the movement and so on. So the planning is kind of, you know, rough, as I said. So we need to have areas that help the cortex make the plan more refined and more exact. Also, maybe you might not know this, apparently our motor cortex, all it wants to do is make our bodies move, even if there is no actual need for it. So someone needs to tell it, whoa, relax, calm down, make only the movements that are necessary. There is no logic in going around the world and flapping your hands and feet all over the place. So we also need areas that inhibit the cortex. And these areas are not part of the cortex itself. These are what we call subcortical areas. These are areas which are deeper in the brain, beneath the cortex. And we have 2 such systems. One is the cerebellum. בעברית הוא נקרא מוחון. So the cerebellum is responsible for the first thing that I said. The cerebellum does the fine-tuning of the movements. So it helps the motor cortex plan the movements better. The other system is a system in English called the basal ganglia, or the basal nuclei. בעברית גרעיני הבסיס. And this system is an inhibitory system which usually tells the cortex to calm down and not go crazy. And it's sort of, you can think about it sort of like a filter that lets through only the necessary movements and prevents the cortex from making us, as I said, all day long go around flapping our arms and feet unnecessarily. So let's look at each one of them. The cerebellum, this structure sits right beneath the cortex back here. It looks kind of like a little cauliflower sitting on the brainstem. And as I said, we needed to fine-tune our movements. It's very important for coordination. So it has a lot of anatomical connections with the visual system. It helps the visual information guide our movements in space. Now, for many years, the research about the cerebellum was only about its motor functions. But lately we know that the cerebellum is also a very important part of the emotional system. So we'll talk about this soon. And also it's very important for certain kinds of learning, and specifically Pavlovian learning, classical conditioning. התנועה קלאסית. So the dogs that hear it was actually not a bell, it was a ticking device, a metronome, and start salivating. We know that if in some way we hurt the cerebellum, then the animal or the person will not be able to learn classical conditioning. So it's also a very important structure for cognition, and not only for movement. Now, we know that when the cerebellum doesn't function properly, as I said, people have a lot of motor difficulties. So the movements, again, they become really fragmented. When you look at someone trying to reach for a bottle, if his cerebellum doesn't work properly, there will not be this kind of nice flowing movement, but he will move like this. He will not be able to integrate properly the control of the muscle. When people have problems in the cerebellum, one of the things that neurologists always ask them to do is touch the tip of the nose with your finger, and they have a very difficult time doing it. And here you can see, when I send you the presentation, you have two links to YouTube videos. One of them is this guy with a problem in his cerebellum trying to touch his nose unsuccessfully, and the other one, if I remember correctly, is a little kid. I think he's about 5 or 6 years old, and he has problems with his cerebellum, and he's at the doctor, and the doctor is filming him trying to walk, and you can see him really wobbling all over the place and losing his balance, and again, because of the trouble in his cerebellum.
You said that before.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, so now I want to go back, because we're talking about coordination and balance, I want to go back to the vestibular sense that we talked about in the beginning. And just to remind you that the vestibular system sends sensory information to the brain, which helps the brain know my position in space relative to the ground, where my head is, and we need this vestibular system to be able to stand upright, to not lose our balance. Okay? And as I said, when this system doesn't work, people get vertigo, which are really bad. They get really dizzy, they feel nauseous. It's kind of like you're on a boat rocking in the ocean, and it's a terrible feeling because your eyes tell you that you're standing upright on solid ground, but your brain just doesn't get it, and then you have to spend, I don't know, I spent about 3 days in bed. I wasn't able to stand up. I had to lie down, and every time I tried to stand up, bad things would happen. I couldn't eat for those 3 days because anything I tried to eat would immediately come up, and then it went away and never came back, thankfully. So again, this is the system that helps us, stand and be balanced. Now, our vestibular sense, or the sensory organs of the vestibular systems, are located in the inner ear. And that's why when we have ear infections, sometimes we get vestibular problems. But why am I talking about this system? Because we know that this system, when it doesn't function properly, and especially in kids, it doesn't only affect our sense of balance or our sense of physical balance, it also affects our sense of emotional balance. And here in the Tel Aviv University, about, I think, 6 years ago, there was a series of studies published from the laboratory of Professor Mati Mintz. For people who know him, they know him.
He gave a lecture.
Okay. He gave a lecture, so I'm not going to repeat, but he talked to you about his research with kids with anxiety and balance treatments. Okay, great. So I'm gonna.
Not everybody. I think I sent you the article. I think I sent you the information.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll just jump ahead because I don't want to repeat stuff that you already heard.
So Noah, maybe
Just to summarize, so they found out that in kids that have vestibular problems, there is a high statistical chance of also suffering from anxiety disorders, and they think that the anxiety disorders are because of the vestibular problems. Because these kids are physically unbalanced, because they don't have good coordination, then they develop anxiety. Sometimes even anxiety is so severe that they have to get psychiatric treatment and so on. And what they did is devise a very simple training program with physical therapists to work on the coordination problems, and they showed that once the coordination problems go away, the anxiety goes away as well. And they're talking about, just a second, they're talking about the fact that if we can find these little kids, 2-year-old, 3-year-olds, and identify that they have vestibular problems, these kids might in a few years develop anxiety problems, and if we identify them soon enough when we give them vestibular treatments, then the anxiety will not show. Okay, so that's basically what they showed, yeah.
Let's assume in a child the vestibular system is weak, for example, and it shows difficulty with coordination and anxiety. So by helping the child to coordinate better, does it influence the brain as well, or does it just learn to reflect?
Yeah, so Mathematical studies, they didn't look at the brain, they just took measures of anxiety and vestibular functioning, but there are other studies that show that yes, when you work on the vestibular system and when there is a change, this change will be reflected in changes in the brain, because our brain is very plastic, it changes. So once you see the behavior change, then you know that the brain has changed as well. Yeah. So this is, for us, this is the big hope, that these things are not set in stone, but if we work on them, the brain will react and adapt itself. Yeah. Okay. The basal ganglia system, as I said, this system is responsible for filtering all the movements that our motor cortex wants to carry out, and this system will tell it this movement is critical, this movement is not critical, do not make it. So this system, usually what it does is to inhibit the motor cortex. Also, this system is responsible for what we call automatic movements. Now, what do I mean by automatic movements? These are movements that we are so proficient in executing that we don't need to think about them, okay? And again, I will give you an example. Think back to your first driving lesson, okay? How much time did it take you just to start your car? I think it took me about 4 minutes. And how much time does it take you to start your car now? And
The driver.
what?
It depends on the driver.
And today when you're driving, do you have to be conscious of your driving? I mean, do you have to think, okay, now I have to press the gas, now I have to press the brake? You don't have to think about it. So your body sort of remembers what to do. And this is because once we become really proficient in a movement, the system that controls it is not the cortex anymore, it's this system of the basal ganglia. And this is very economic because it frees our cortex to deal with other things, okay? So as I'm driving to work, I don't need to think about driving, I think about all the things I have to do today, and I have to go shopping, I didn't have time, so yeah.
We have the results on the road.
Yeah.
If you go back and do that same movement that's on automatic for it, but you're doing it with awareness, does it bypass the basal ganglia and go back to the frontal cortex?
It will recruit the cortex, but a lot of times you can try it at home. If you have a movement which is already automatic, and then you try to think about it consciously, you will find that it's very difficult to carry it out.
Do it all the time.
Yeah, and that if you think about really professional athletes, when they get to what we call the money time, okay, so this tennis player that has to give the serve that will win him the Wimbledon Cup, they know, and there are sports psychologists working with them, that if at that moment he starts consciously thinking, then usually, yeah.
If you do that, does it actually also rewire the basal ganglia will do when you go back?
It can, if you do it enough times, yeah. Okay, but again, this is, as I said, this is an advantage for the cortex to say, okay, these are movements that we've done hundreds of times. There's no need for me to be involved. Someone else can do it. Okay. Now, what I said before about inhibition, that our cortex always wants to be active, we know that diseases in the brain that affect the basal ganglia will have the effects on our ability to inhibit movement. Now, Parkinson, a very known motor disorder. What happens in Parkinson's is that the inhibition of the basal ganglia becomes excessive, and so people that have Parkinson's at the later stages, they have a lot of difficulty initiating and carrying out movements. And from the other famous disorder that is related is the Huntington's disease. Do you know Huntington's? So Huntington's is a degenerative disease of the brain, and parts of the basal ganglia, just the neurons in them just start to die. And in that case, the inhibition is not strong enough. Okay, so the cortex is uninhibited, and what we see in Huntington's patients is what we call Huntington's chorea. Like from choreography, they have a lot of involuntary movements of the hands and feet, so they can't sit still. They're always doing these movements, and there are other effects on the brain. There's also cognitive and emotional deterioration, and it's a fatal condition. We can't treat it today, but again, the most famous symptoms are the motor disinhibition, because the basal ganglia stop working, and then the cortex sort of, is released to do whatever it wants. Okay? Sorry?
גם האזור שנפגע בטיפול הסכיזופרניה יצר סימפטומים של פרקינסון?
אזור שנפגע, לא, את מדברת על התרופות שעושות, כן, בגלל ש... נכון, זה מהדופמין.
כן.
Yeah, she said in sometimes we see that when we give schizophrenic patients the antipsychotic medicine, then they develop Parkinson-like symptoms, because the medicine it shuts down the basal ganglia, or not shuts down, it makes them work stronger. So then we see stronger, because then the cortex is really inhibited. But it will usually pass once you balance the patient with the right dose. Okay? פגיעות רציניות, again, these are neurodegenerative diseases, מחלות ניווניות של המוח. So you see whole areas of the brain just disappear. Okay? Now again, this system is not only a motor system, it is also very important for cognition. We know that it helps us create habits. And if you think about it, what is a habit? A habit is a movement that we do over and over again. And if this system is unbalanced, then we get compulsive behaviors. So this system is really involved in obsessive compulsive disorder, in Tourette's, in what we call trichotillomania, the people that pluck out their hair and their eyebrows. Also important for what we call operant conditioning, our ability to associate certain kinds of stimuli with certain kinds of movements. So the rat in the Skinner box, which presses the lever to get a tasty piece of food, yeah, or the kid in the supermarket having a tantrum to get the chocolate bar that his parents will inevitably buy him.
The basal ganglia.
Yeah, the basal ganglia helps us connect, okay, if I see this, then I need to do this in order for this to happen. Okay, so in the supermarket, if I lie on the floor and start screaming, mom will buy me the chocolate. Okay?
This is an extreme example.
Yeah. We use it all the time. Yeah? Okay. The last area that I will talk about is the primary motor cortex. This is the last station in the brain before the information is sent out towards the spinal cord. This area is responsible to tell the groups of muscles in the body, okay, now you have to move, and this is how you have to move. So he gets all the planning from the other areas of the cortex, from the cerebellum, from the basal ganglia, and he sends it out to the muscles. And our primary motor cortex is built in the shape of what we call a homunculus, ish katan, little person. So specific areas of the motor cortex will control specific groups of muscles in the body. And this is a set arrangement. So we all in our brains, we have basically the same shape of homunculus. So if I could now take a device that will operate a specific part of your primary motor cortex, then you will start moving a specific part of your body, and it's a very strange sensation, again, because there you will literally feel as if someone is pulling your strings, but it can be done. Now, what we know about this motor homunculus is that it is extremely plastic. Plastic means it is extremely able to change. So if we get really good at some sort of movement, it means the area on the cortex that controls that specific group of muscles gets bigger. Okay, it creates more synapses, it creates more connections between the nerve cells in that area, and also vice versa. If we have an area of the body which we don't use, then the area on the cortex will get smaller and other areas around it will sort of swallow it up. So we see like people that play musical instruments, violinists or people that play the piano and are very good at what they do, the areas in the brain that control the fingers get bigger. People that lose limbs after accidents and so on, we can see that the areas in the brain that control the missing limbs, they get smaller, okay? And this happens from the day you're born until the day you say goodbye. So we have this ability. That's why we are always able to learn new movements. Of course, when we are young, it's much easier, okay? Okay, the final stage is getting the plan out to the body, and then we're talking about the spinal cord. In the spinal cord we have a big system of neurons which are called alpha motor neurons, and these are the neurons that send messages to the muscles. They are connected to the muscles all over our body. They release a chemical called acetylcholine. And this chemical, when it attaches to the muscle, it starts a series of events that will eventually make the muscle contract. Okay? This is, of course, why people with spinal cord injuries lose the ability to move, because the brain can no longer send output to the muscles. And here I get to the last part, which is again the sensory part. Yeah.
So it releases the acetylcholine, which makes the muscles contract.
Mm-hmm.
Is that responsible for, in CP, for the spastic constant contracture? Is that they're getting lots of acetylcholine?
No, CP is, I think it's from more from a brain origin, because probably the motor areas in the brain don't work properly. And then they send out, again, I'm not an expert on CP, but probably they will send out too much excitation out to the muscles. Okay, so it's a brain. But if you have any disorder which is related to acetylcholine, then you will have problems controlling your muscle. By the way, nerve gas works by making the body release too much acetylcholine, and then we see the painful muscle contractions. Acetylcholine. Okay. על הגז עצבים? כן, אמרתי שההפרעות שקשורות לאצטילכולין ישפיעו על היכולת שלך לכווץ שרירים. אז גז עצבים, בעצם מה שהוא עושה, הוא גורם לנוירונים האלפא-מוטוריים לשחרר יותר מדי אצטילכולין, ואז את מקבלת כווצויות שרירים מכאיבות. אוקיי? אוקיי. now, סליחה?
משחקים זה...
נכון, בדיוק. Now, the final stage, after I plan the movement and after it has been sent out to the muscles, as I said, is getting the sensory feedback back up into the brain, so my brain knows that the muscle has carried out the movement. And here again we go back to our sense of proprioception. As I said, this is the information that the brain gets from the muscles, from the ligaments, and from the joints. We have special receptors in all these organs, and they are sensitive to muscle contraction and relaxation, and this is the information that they send into the brain. Now, we need proprioception to be able to control our bodies, because this basically forms our feeling of embodiment. Okay, so each one of us feels that he is, what is embodiment? It's me feeling that I'm in my own body, that my body is separate from the outer world, okay, and that I control my body, I make the movements because I want to make them and not because someone else is operating me. And this basically helps the brain know that it's sitting inside a body, okay? Now, again, this is very important not only for my motor abilities, but also for my sense of psychological well-being, because this is part of the way that the brain makes us, that the brain creates the feeling of self, okay? A big part of the self is the embodied self, yeah? My body is mine and it's separate from other bodies, and we need proprioception for this. And how do we know? Because there are few people in the world walking among us, not walking, unable to walk among us, which have lost proprioception. It can happen due to all kinds of infections, and these infections will in fact destroy the proprioception receptors. And these people literally get paralyzed, not because their muscles don't work and not because something is wrong with the motor systems in the brain, but because the brain has become blind to the fact that there is a body, okay? Now what you see behind me, this guy, which at this moment I forgot his name, he's a British guy, and I think when he was not too old, I think when he was about 18 or 19, he got an infection, and this infection obliterated his proprioception, and he became paralyzed. And you see him lying in the hospital, that his mother took him to the hospital because she didn't know what was going on. And when he was in the hospital, the doctors told him, "We're sorry, you've lost your proprioceptive abilities and you're going to stay paralyzed for the rest of your life." Now this is paralyzed, not sitting in a wheelchair, paralyzed lying in bed and unable to move. Or sometimes he talks about it. He says, if I was lying in bed and I was looking at my body, it wouldn't move. And then when I turned my head, then suddenly my hands would start flailing around out of control. And he was not willing to accept what the doctors told him. And he's, at least as far as I know, he's the only person in the world who has been able to teach himself to move again, even without proprioception. His name is Ian. Now remember, his name is Ian. If you go to the BBC site, this link, there is about a 1-hour documentary about him. And what he did was sort of bypass his proprioception by first of all, always looking at his body. So instead of proprioception, he's using vision to tell his brain where his body is. And that's why when he walks, you can see him in the movie when he walks and he looks down at his legs. And if while walking he picks his head up, then he falls, because his brain doesn't know where his legs are. And also, if you think about it, proprioception helps us control our muscles in a way which is not conscious. We don't have to think about it, right? When I'm standing up, I don't have to think about, using my core muscles to stay upright. And he does. So what he does, if you think about it, it's quite amazing. He has to, every minute of every day, when he wants to move, he always has to think about, standing up. Okay, I need to tighten the muscles of my stomach, and I need to tighten the muscles in my behind. And when I walk, okay, I need to pick up my right leg and put it forward, and now I need to pick up my left leg. So if you can imagine the mental effort of having to think about each and every movement that you do, it's quite amazing. And probably this is why he's the only person up to now that has been able to do it. And in the movie, again, you see him, and you see other people in his condition, and he's, walking, talking, gesturing, which he does consciously. He has to think about every gesture, but it was important to him because he wanted to look normal. And there is this person sitting beside him with exactly the same condition, that the minute they try to get him out of the chair, he sort of, falls down to the ground, and he can't move. So this is quite amazing. Okay? Sorry? Mm-hmm. Yeah. מה? המוח הגמיש? הספר. כן. כן, כן, נכון. Okay, so I'll just wrap up and then I'll give you time for questions. So I've come back to the first slide just to show you that hopefully we covered all the things that we talked about, okay? Our ability to get input from the outside environment, the ability of our brain to decide that this requires some sort of movement, and how to plan and execute the movement, and in the end, again, the sensory information going back to the brain, telling it, okay, your plan is being carried out successfully. I could talk about this for hours, but we're a bit short on time, so this is me finishing. If you have any questions, yeah. Mm-hmm. It's so related to yeah. So kinesthesia is actually, it's related to proprioception, but it's part of the vestibular system. In the vestibular system we have special receptors which tell the brain our velocity of speed and the direction of movement and so on.
So it's not actually the vestibular itself, it's not just connections between the vestibular system.
Yeah. Yeah, but again, we have specific receptors which are responsible for these abilities, but it's part of the vestibular system. אין בעיה. כן, כן.
You mentioned that when he lost his body, he used his eyesight.
Mm-hmm.
But actually he did it with his thinking. I mean,
his eyesight and his ability to think about everything he does consciously. Yeah.
I mean, he tells himself to move your leg.
Exactly. Yeah.
The weight on it.
Exactly.
But only thinking.
Only thinking, yeah, he has to think about it consciously.
He needs to see. Without seeing his... Yeah.
He needs to see, but again, like when he sits, he doesn't have to look at his body, but he has to think.
To start it with the
seeing
and
okay.
combine it with...
Yeah.
Excuse me, we are trying to document all this, and if we don't use the microphone, it will not be heard.
Okay.
Okay? It's not that I'm,
Yeah.
I like to run around. So please take the time, take the microphone, and then it will all be documented.
Okay, I would like to ask about the emotional part. You were talking about the fact that the brain gives the order to move, and then it gives back feedback that the movement just was done. What happens emotionally if it was successful, and what happens if the movement was done but not successfully? What happens emotionally in the brain?
Well, again, it depends on the movement. Like if I wanted to pick up a bottle of water and I didn't do it right, I don't think it will really, mean anything emotionally, but again, like if we think, okay, this kid is playing a soccer game, and now he's standing in front of the goal area, and he's in a kicks, and the ball doesn't go in, then of course, this sensory information that goes back to the brain from, like if he knows that he made the movement wrong, or if he can see that the ball hasn't gone into the goal area, then of course this will light up his amygdala, which will tell him, you know, you did some, yeah.
So how does it go?
Our senses are directly connected to the amygdala, and once the amygdala gets activated, it sends the signals back to the body, which makes our body create some sort of emotional state. Yeah. So if he's disappointed, if he's sad, if he's angry, it depends on the emotion.
You didn't talk about the chemical executing. If he's successful, he receives more chemical. She heard, and you can decide.
You're talking about the chemical system? So of course, when you make a successful movement, like this kid now scored a goal, of course his brain will get full of dopamine, and dopamine will make him feel good, and his brain will get full of adrenaline, and the adrenaline will make him feel more, aroused, and oxytocin maybe if he's interacting socially. Yeah, these are very complex systems. So again, I can make you a whole year of lectures about it. Okay. Yeah. נכון.
ושזה בעצם תהליך המשאבים עבור 80%
Okay, so she's saying that in Feldenkrais and in general, when you think about the whole process of planning and executing the movement, the execution is sort of like the last 20%, and most of the effort is put into planning and controlling. Yeah, that's the thing, Basically, the most important part again, no, this is not correct, but she was saying, it wasn't a question, she made a comment that most of the motor process is done inside the brain, and only the end is actually sending the information to the muscles. Yeah. Now I will say more than this, and then you will excuse me, we will have to finish because it's late, and I have my husband's great aunt's birthday, and if we're later going to kill me. We know today that when people imagine movement, motor areas in the brain light up as if they were actually executing the movement. And more than that, sometimes just by imagining yourself moving, you can teach yourself to move better. Yeah, so if you just sit and think about, okay, so tomorrow I have a dance recital. I'm sitting here and I'm, running my dance through my imaginary, body. Then the day after, you will probably dance better. Okay? You need to practice. Of course, if I sit down here, I will never be a prima ballerina. You need to practice, but just imagining the movement will rewire your motor areas and so on. Yeah. So I'm sorry, really, I would love to stay here and talk to you, but you have my email, and I will be more than happy, to talk to you via email and through Chava. Okay, so have a nice day.